Richard Hale once owned the city. With skyscrapers in his name, luxury cars in his garage, and an endless stream of admirers at his side, he believed he was untouchable. But when the markets crashed, so did his empire. In a single week, the billionaire who ruled over boardrooms and penthouses lost everything. The same people who once toasted to his brilliance now mocked his downfall. And as if fate enjoyed irony, the loudest laughter came from the very circles that had once praised him most. Homeless in spirit and fortune, Richard wandered, stripped of all illusions of grandeur. No one offered him a hand, not the investors, not the so-called friends. The man who had fired his gardener without a second thought, calling him replaceable, now stood alone. Until James Ortega appeared. A man Richard had dismissed as unimportant. A man with dirt under his nails but wisdom in his soul. And in that moment, Richard would learn, sometimes, the one you look down on is the very one who lifts you up. The world thought he was finished. But with James's guidance, Richard's story was only just beginning. Richard Holloway had once believed himself untouchable. Sitting atop his glass tower overlooking the city, he was the embodiment of power and wealth. His empire stretched across continents, luxury hotels, tech investments, oil, even sports teams. He had been born into privilege and had multiplied it with relentless ambition. For years, his word was law, his name synonymous with grandeur. But arrogance has a way of blinding a man to the fragility of fortune. It began subtly, like cracks spreading unseen beneath polished marble. A risky investment in a cutting-edge energy company went sour. His board reassured him at first, calling it a hiccup in the market. Yet one failure bled into another. The market turned hostile, creditors circled, and rumors of incompetence swirled among investors. Richard dismissed them with the same icy smile he gave to waiters, gardeners, and anyone else he deemed beneath him. He believed money insulated him from consequences. Then came the lawsuits. Former partners dragged him into courtrooms, painting him not as a visionary, but as a reckless gambler. The media latched on, tearing apart his reputation. Headlines that once praised his brilliance now mocked his downfall, from billionaire to bankrupt. His name became a spectacle, his downfall entertainment for the masses who once envied him. But the cruelest blow was personal. His circle of so-called friends, those who had basked in his wealth, vanished almost overnight. His phone, once buzzing incessantly with requests, invitations, and opportunities, now lay silent. Even family members distanced themselves, wary of being dragged down by the stigma of his collapse. Richard, who had towered over all, found himself alone in a cavernous penthouse filled with echoes and unpaid bills. One by one, his assets were seized. The collection of rare cars he flaunted as trophies was repossessed. His private jet, once a symbol of freedom, was sold to cover debts. He clung to his last hotel property, swearing he would rebuild from it, but the courts stripped that too. Soon, the billionaire who had once dismissed humanity as background noise stood in a courtroom, his voice trembling as judges declared his empire dissolved. But pride is a stubborn thing. Richard refused to bow, refused to admit defeat. He stalked the streets of the city he once ruled from above, still wearing his tailored suits, though frayed at the edges. He thought people would recognize him, offer him opportunities out of respect or admiration. Instead, he became invisible. To the world, he was just another man who had lost. The bitter irony was not lost on him when he stumbled back into the manicured gardens of his former estate, not as its master, but as an onlooker. The mansion, once echoing with laughter during his grand parties, now belonged to a faceless bank. The garden, still lush and perfectly trimmed, stirred memories of the man who had tended it with devotion, Gabriel, the gardener Richard had once fired. It had been a petty act. One morning years ago, Richard had walked through the estate's rose paths, displeased with the way the blossoms leaned toward the sun. He accused Gabriel of neglect, ignoring the man's quiet explanation about weather patterns and natural growth. "You're replaceable," Richard had snapped, and with a wave of his hand, dismissed the gardener who had given years of his life to nurturing the land. That memory now resurfaced with venom. Richard had barely thought of Gabriel since, why would he? To him, the gardener was a shadow, a background figure unworthy of notice. And yet, as Richard stood outside the gates of his former home, broken and stripped of power, it was Gabriel's face that haunted him. Life, it seemed, had a cruel sense of balance. The billionaire who once had everything was now reduced to nothing. His arrogance, once his shield, now tasted like ash in his mouth. But in the quiet of his despair, beneath the city lights that no longer belonged to him, a question took root: what now? He had mocked the gardener's labor, dismissed his worth, and yet Richard now found himself yearning for purpose, for a seed of redemption. And fate, waiting patiently like a gardener with shears, was about to prune the last of Richard's illusions. And right here, at Richard's lowest point, with pride shattered and his future uncertain, comes the moment of truth. Because sometimes life takes everything away just to show you what really matters, and who truly has the wisdom to guide you. But before we see what happens next, let me ask you this: are you enjoying stories where the mighty fall and the humble rise? Then make sure you subscribe right now and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss the powerful moment when Richard faces the very gardener he once dismissed and discovers a truth he never expected. Richard wandered the streets with no clear destination. His shoes, once polished to a mirror shine, were scuffed from days of walking aimlessly. Pride had kept him from begging, but hunger gnawed at him, and the weight of invisibility pressed harder than hunger itself. He was no longer Richard Holloway, billionaire titan. He was just another man the world ignored. It was on one of these aimless walks that he passed through a small neighborhood park. Children laughed as they chased each other between flower beds, and elders sat on benches trading stories. The sight made Richard ache. Life continued, indifferent to his collapse. And then, near the edge of the park, his eyes froze. There was Gabriel. Bent slightly with age but steady in his movements, the gardener worked on a patch of roses with the same quiet dedication Richard remembered from years ago. Gabriel's hands, calloused but gentle, guided the stems with patience, coaxing beauty from the soil. Time had etched lines on his face, but his presence radiated calm strength. Richard stood rooted, 1,000 memories rushing back. He remembered dismissing Gabriel without a thought, mocking his explanations, cutting short his loyalty with arrogance. And yet here Gabriel was, still tending life, still purposeful, still dignified. The contrast between them hit Richard like a physical blow. He, once master of empires, now lost and purposeless; Gabriel, a man of the earth, steady and fulfilled. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, Richard wanted to look away, to flee. But Gabriel's gaze was not accusing, it was curious, calm, perhaps even tinged with recognition. Richard swallowed hard, shame rising in his throat. "You look like you've been carrying a heavy load," Gabriel said softly, straightening his back. His voice was the same, steady, unhurried, grounded. Richard forced a bitter smile. "You could say that. I've lost everything." Gabriel studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then perhaps it's time to learn what really matters." The words cut deeper than any headline, deeper than the gloating of former friends. Richard felt exposed. Yet something in Gabriel's tone wasn't cruel, it was an invitation. An opening. For the first time in his life, Richard asked for help. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to be anything else. I don't even know who I am without it all." Gabriel set down his shears and motioned toward the soil. "Start here. With the ground. With your hands. The earth teaches humility if you're willing to listen." Richard blinked, almost incredulous. Gardening? After everything he had lost, after the collapse of his empire, Gabriel wanted him to kneel in the dirt? But as the seconds passed, the idea seemed less insulting and more freeing. For the first time in months, someone wasn't asking him for money, wasn't blaming him, wasn't mocking him. Gabriel was offering him purpose. Reluctantly, Richard knelt. The soil was cool, damp between his fingers. Gabriel guided him, how to loosen roots without breaking them, how to replant carefully, how to water with patience. Richard fumbled, his manicured hands clumsy, but Gabriel's steady voice corrected gently, never mocking. With each motion, something shifted inside Richard. The noise of judgment, the weight of his ego, began to soften. There was a strange peace in the simplicity of tending to life. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control or dominate, he was learning to nurture. "You once told me I was replaceable," Gabriel said quietly after a long silence. Richard froze, guilt flooding him. But Gabriel's voice carried no bitterness. "Turns out, we're all replaceable. What matters is the impact we leave behind." Richard looked at him, unable to respond. His throat ached with unshed words, apology, regret, gratitude. But for now, he let the silence speak. In that moment, kneeling in the dirt beside the gardener he had once dismissed, Richard realized that perhaps this was the beginning, not of rebuilding his empire, but of rebuilding himself. The days that followed were unlike anything Richard had ever known. For the first time in his life, his schedule was not filled with board meetings, flights, or elite dinners. It was filled with soil, seeds, and sweat. Gabriel welcomed him without conditions, but he also didn't coddle him. There were no shortcuts, no luxuries, only honest work. Richard's body resisted at first. His back ached from bending, his palms blistered from tools unaccustomed to soft skin. More than once he nearly quit, humiliated by his weakness. But each time, Gabriel's steady presence anchored him. "The earth doesn't care who you were," the gardener would say. "It only responds to what you do now." That phrase became Richard's quiet mantra. Slowly, painfully, he adapted. Muscles he had never used began to strengthen. His suits gave way to worn jeans and shirts stained with dirt. And with each day, he felt less like a fallen emperor and more like a student rediscovering life. One afternoon, while they worked side by side, a group of local community members approached the garden. They greeted Gabriel warmly, thanking him for the vegetables he donated to the neighborhood kitchen. Richard stood awkwardly, half expecting ridicule when they recognized him. But to his surprise, they barely cared about his old identity. To them, he was simply another set of hands helping Gabriel. For Richard, this was more jarring than any headline. All his life, he had defined worth by wealth and status. Yet here, among ordinary people, value was measured by generosity, consistency, and humility. Gabriel, the man he had once dismissed as replaceable, was revered not for riches, but for the life he nurtured in others. Later that day, as they sat under the shade of an oak, Richard finally broke the silence. "Why are you helping me? After everything I did to you, after the way I treated you, you should hate me." Gabriel looked at him calmly. "Hate? No. I pitied you. You thought power made you strong, but it only made you fragile. Now you have the chance to be stronger than you ever were." The words hit Richard harder than any financial collapse. Stronger than before? Could that even be possible? He had lost everything, yet here was Gabriel suggesting that perhaps he had gained something greater. The climax of this strange journey came when Gabriel invited Richard to join him in teaching a group of children from the community. They were curious, eager to learn how to plant seeds and tend to sprouts. Richard hesitated, unaccustomed to small eyes looking up to him not as a billionaire, but as a guide. His hands trembled as he showed them how to place a seed gently into the earth. The children laughed when his clumsy fingers spilled soil, but it wasn't cruel laughter, it was pure, innocent joy. For the first time in years, Richard laughed with them. And when the small sprouts broke through the ground days later, the pride he felt rivaled any corporate triumph he had ever known. News of Richard's strange new life inevitably spread. A journalist who had once mocked his fall discovered him working in the garden and came to witness the transformation. The article that followed didn't speak of scandal or failure, it spoke of redemption. It described a man humbled, a man who had traded skyscrapers for soil, arrogance for humility. And to Richard's shock, the world responded not with mockery, but with respect. Even a former business rival, once eager to see him ruined, visited discreetly. Watching Richard work alongside Gabriel, the rival admitted, "You look different. Happier, even." Richard only smiled faintly, realizing that for once, he didn't need to prove anything. The validation he once chased in boardrooms now came from a deeper source: the children's laughter, the community's gratitude, Gabriel's quiet nods of approval. He had fallen from the highest towers of wealth, but in the soil, he had found something richer. Richard Holloway, the billionaire who had lost everything, was no longer the man defined by money. He was becoming something far rarer, a man defined by humility, wisdom, and the courage to start again. The seasons changed, and with them, so did Richard. By the time summer stretched its warm fingers across the city, he was almost unrecognizable. The sharp lines of arrogance that had once defined his face had softened, his eyes carried a depth forged from struggle and humility. His hands, blistered and scarred, bore testimony to the labor that had redefined him. And in the garden, among rows of vegetables and blooms, Richard found peace he had never known in penthouses or boardrooms. But life has a way of circling back, demanding resolution. One afternoon, as Richard and Gabriel loaded crates of fresh produce for the neighborhood kitchen, a sleek car pulled up beside the curb. Out stepped two men in tailored suits, figures from Richard's former world. His old associates. Men who had once cheered his triumphs and then vanished during his downfall. Richard Holloway, one of them said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Never thought I'd see the day you'd be hauling tomatoes instead of profits." The sting of their laughter pierced him, a sharp reminder of the man he had been. But before Richard could speak, Gabriel stepped forward calmly. "Funny thing about tomatoes," he said evenly. "They actually feed people. Can't say the same about greed." The crowd of community members, gathered to collect the food, chuckled softly at Gabriel's quiet jab. The men in suits, and used to being dismissed, bristled. But Richard didn't flinch. For the first time in his life, he felt no need to defend himself with bravado. Their mockery no longer held power. Later that week, Richard was summoned to court again, not as a defendant, but as a witness. The very partners who had abandoned him were now entangled in scandals of their own: tax fraud, embezzlement, corruption. Their empire, built on lies and shortcuts, was collapsing. Reporters crowded the courthouse, eager to capture the spectacle. Richard stood silently in the witness box, listening as the accusations mounted against men who had once mocked him. There was no gloating in his eyes, only a quiet recognition: this was justice, not revenge. They had sown greed, and now they reaped ruin. As he left the courthouse, flashes of cameras blinded him, but for once he felt no shame. He had no empire to defend, no image to maintain. He had only truth, and that was enough. Back in the community, Richard's transformation became impossible to ignore. He worked beside Gabriel not for profit, but for purpose. He organized fundraisers to expand the neighborhood kitchen, drawing on skills he once used to build billion-dollar deals. But now, those skills were used to uplift, not to dominate. Children who once whispered his name with confusion now ran to him with smiles, calling him Mr. Richard as they tugged at his hands to show him their tiny seedlings. The karmic resolution was clear: the arrogant friends who had abandoned him were disgraced, the elites who had laughed at his downfall were silent, and Richard, the man who had once fired a gardener with contempt, now found his worth in the soil and the laughter of children. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, Richard sat beside Gabriel under the oak tree. "I used to think wealth was power," Richard said softly. "But it was nothing but chains. You taught me to break them." Gabriel smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "No, Richard. The soil taught you. You just needed to be willing to learn." Silence stretched comfortably between them, broken only by the distant sound of children playing. Richard breathed deeply, savoring the scent of earth and flowers. He no longer dreamed of skyscrapers or yachts. His dreams were simpler now: growth, community, purpose. In the end, Richard did not return to the world of billionaires. He didn't need to. His legacy was not in glass towers but in the lives he touched. The gardener he once fired had given him something no fortune ever could: the chance to start over as a man of worth, not wealth. And as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Richard knew the truth. He had not lost everything. He had found everything that mattered. And there you have it, a billionaire who once thought money could buy him everything, discovering that true wealth often lies in humility, resilience, and the wisdom of those we tend to overlook. The gardener, with his calloused hands and quiet strength, showed that starting over isn't about riches or reputation, but about grit and the willingness to learn. And in that, he taught not just the fallen billionaire, but all of us, what it really means to rise again. So now I turn it over to you. Have you ever underestimated someone, only to be surprised by how much they had to teach you? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Let's build a space where we lift each other up, just like the gardener did in this story. And if this tale moved you, make sure to follow the channel so you never miss another story of redemption, justice, and the power of the human spirit.